It's a question that's almost as old as the Enterprise herself. Where is engineering? And it's a fair question, since the producers of the original Star Trek didn't exactly go out of their way to nail down the technical details of the starship they dreamed up. Unlike the later productions, where we got official cutaway drawings and cross-sections showing us precisely where the main engine room was, how it was situated in relation to the warp core, and so forth. Mainly to avoid more rounds of this exact question rearing its head once again. On the original show, however, the official policy was that they were more interested in telling stories about people, not technology, and writers were instructed to focus on that and not get caught up in all the gadgetry. Besides, anything the fans dreamt up was probably going to be better than what they came up with, so let them have their fun. That being said, though, a few tidbits were provided in the 1968 book The Making of Star Trek, where some general notes on the overall layout of the ship were specified. And although the landmark book is an invaluable text on television production even today, and has plenty of historical insights into the development of the show, as a technical manual it's rather lacking. While they put far more thought into the technical details than, say, any of the Irwin Allen productions at the time, that didn't mean they sweated out every detail, certainly not to the level of the later shows. As stated before, they were making an action-adventure TV show, not a NASA documentary. Conquest of space, this ain't. So it was in the early 1970s, a draftsman by the name of Franz Joseph Schnabelt, whose daughter Karen was a huge Star Trek fan, often assisting Bjo Trimble while she was running Lincoln Enterprises. This eventually resulted in the landmark works, the Starfleet Technical Manual, and the Booklet of General Plans, also known as the Enterprise Blueprints. Now again, these are both landmark pieces of work and set the standard for just about every such work that followed. But that being said, that doesn't mean they're in any way accurate. Remember, Schnabelt was not a hardcore fan. He did this as a favor for his daughter and her friends. And the available reference materials were practically non-existent at the time, and what was there was often contradictory. As such, we're lucky these works are even close. So that we don't wind up going down a rabbit hole, let's just say that while we acknowledge those works for their historical significance in the history of Star Trek, they are of no real use for telling us where engineering is. Instead, we're going back to the source, the show itself, with some influences from the later productions and taking into account their findings on the subject. First, let's establish where main engineering isn't. It is not in the primary hull next to the impulse engines. For one thing, it doesn't fit. Secondly, it would block turbolift access to the secondary hull. While there is undoubtedly some sort of engine room there, it's not the one we saw in the show. Or rather, I should say ones, since the room changed significantly between first and second season, to the point where they're really not even the same room anymore. I'll go into a deeper dive on that later. The first time engineering shows up on film is The Enemy Within, where Kirk refers to it as the lower levels, meaning down in the secondary hull, or as it's also known, the engineering hull. In fact, when Matt Jeffries was asked where engineering was, he gave the person an odd look and answered, in the engineering hull, with a sort of an unspoken expression of duh. So, from the earliest days of the show, and in the mind of the guy who designed the ship in the first place, engineering is down in the engineering hull. Yeah, duh. So, where exactly in that hull is it? The easy answer is to look at those big glowing orange tubes, figure they lead straight to the nacelles, bingo, job done, who's up for lunch? Not so fast, smart guy. For one thing, those tubes are clearly at the wrong angle to be leading to the nacelles. Not just the angling in part, but even if you cross on through, the angle is way too steep to match up with the nacelle struts. Plus, that puts engineering right up against the forward bulkhead of the hangar deck, which doesn't really seem like a good idea. So, since there's something else going on here, and there's no pressing need for those tubes to line up with the struts, or anything for that matter, let's move it forward a more comfortable distance from the shuttle bay. Okay, where? Let's take a look at the underside of the secondary hull, paying particular attention to those odd shapes, see if they provide any clues. They're clearly technical in nature, with the yellow circle outlined in red being very prominent in a do not block this area kind of way. I think it's not out of line to assume this is the ejection port for the warp reactor. So, in going through the various technical references in the shows themselves, it's clear that those tubes have something to do with the main reactor, although not the main reactor itself. I figure it's the main power distribution manifold sending energy from the reactor to the rest of the ship. This also takes care of those instances where it seems to be connected to the warp drive in one episode and the impulse engines in the next. It's connected to both. So let's figure the tube assembly is directly over the warp core, which is directly over that yellow circle on the underside of the ship. That gets us about halfway. So which way does the room face? Here's where we get into the weeds a bit. Those big thingamajigs in the middle of the room are shown to house the dilithium crystals, which focus and amplify the plasma produced by the warp core to a point where the warp coils in the nacelles can generate the warp field, enabling us to have a show about a starship in the first place. Can't really call it Star Trek if you can't get out of your own solar system, now can you? And it's been very well established that the way the whole thing works is matter and antimatter go boom in the warp core, that boom is directed through the dilithium crystals to make a bigger boom, and that bigger boom is sent to the warp nacelles to generate the warp field. The general idea is there in the original show, most notably Alana Troy's and That Which Survives, but the later shows and movies lay it out much more clearly. So let's look at the Enterprise D's warp core, with the dilithium crystals right there in the reaction chamber, shooting the amplified plasma directly down the conduits of the nacelles. So how do you think it was done 100 years earlier? Not quite so integrated yet, with a little more plumbing involved. The dilithium crystals are away from the warp core, where you can still get at the things without having to shut down the whole reactor, and can still maintain a speed of about warp 2. This also requires that the setup be upstream from the nacelles, but downstream from the warp core. Long story short, this means that when you're in engineering, facing those big glowy tubes, you're facing forward towards the front of the ship. And that version of the engine room we saw in the first season, why, it's still there. It's on the other side of those tubes. It used to be main engineering, but between the first and second seasons, that designation was shifted to the facility after the big manifold, to allow more direct access to the warp core and other systems, while the forward room was likely designated as backup, now mainly concerned with the ship's fusion reactors and other tasks. And there you have it. That's my answer to the question of where engineering is. I think it covers just about every what about this comeback, and I think it covers the whole shoot quite nicely. Like, share, and subscribe. Click on one of the links in the description to support what I'm doing here, and we'll talk at you later.
Thank you.